hiking their way through the sweaty jungles of South Vietnam, searching for an elusive enemy. The temperature is almost 100 degrees, and the jungle stifles even the tiniest breeze. The going is slow. There could be a North Vietnamese regiment hiding a few yards away, and no one would see it. Nobody talks until you start thinking. Specialist Ward Wayne Hoover is thinking he's going to meet his fiancée in Honolulu in 2 weeks, and he will show her the silver star the general pinned on him yesterday. Devalle is the lone medic in the platoon.
That was a brief snippet of the Vietnam War coverage from CBS, a news station from 1970. This is the nightly news, so this is what you might have heard in 1970 as a U.S. citizen. And the reason I start with this is because the Vietnam War was known as the Living Room War. It literally was brought to you live by reporters such as these who were there during the war. And the media plays a critical role from the beginning of the war in 1959, which we're going to cover, on through the end of the war in 1970, in shaping the public opinion of America. Because you have to understand, the Vietnam War at first was a very popular idea up until the late 1960s. The popularity of the war remained, but then we get images like this one I'm about to show you, which are disturbing, which show some of the gross realities of the war, and the credibility gap starts to come about, where the images that the media shows and the coverage of American media, it doesn't match up with what the politicians are telling the people is going on in the war. And America goes from being very much in favor of this war to, by the late 1960s, very much disapproving of the war. And we talked about the New Left today in America's youth, and they played a major role in that. But before we begin, so that's the background to the war and what we're going to get to. So I'm going to start from the beginning and let you answer the questions 1 through 18 on your guide. So go ahead and make sure you have that, and I'll start from the very beginning. Alright, so you got this worksheet in front of you. We're going to go over 1 through 17, and we're going to skip 18 so you can cross that one out. Answer these on a separate sheet of paper. I know we've gone over some of these. You've gone over these in your reading, but I'm just going to quickly go over some of the ones you've already gone over and then go over new stuff. So, alright, the Vietnam War. From the beginning, timeline, what's happening. We'll come back to this, but most of this will be covered. Little background to China. We haven't talked much about communist China, but I want you to think of communist China in a very similar sense to the Soviet Union during this time, the 50s and the 70s. Very strict control under the one-party communist system that has been established. Strict economic controls set by the government. Media censorship doesn't allow free speech, controls the information that people get. And Mao Zedong, he's the leader during this time after the Communist Revolution in 1949. So the reason I'm going over this, well, what's going on in the world besides just the Vietnam War, some other things to give you context. 1965, first major U.S. combat in Vietnam. 1968, Robert Kennedy and MLK are assassinated. And we're going to talk about the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963. Kent State Massacre, which is going to be covered in your presentation, and 1973. By that time, the war is over. What's going on in the world? Mao Zedong, who we're going to talk about, begins his Cultural Revolution in China. More to come on that. And the communists capture Saigon, and South Vietnam surrenders. We'll get to the end of the war later, but that's other things going on in the world besides the Vietnam War during this time period. So that's why we talked about communist China. Mao Zedong became the leader in 1949, rules for decades. Very much like Stalin during that time, 49, until Stalin dies in 53, establishes this cult-like figure. Vast amounts of propaganda promote the supreme leader and his communist party. Treated much like a god would be, right? Religion is destroyed, outlawed. Religious groups are persecuted in communist nations such as the Soviet Union and China, and still today in North Korea. So what's going on in North Korea today is very much like what happened in Soviet Russia and communist China. For your synthesis point, if you were writing an essay, vast amounts of propaganda still exist in North Korea to promote the supreme leader in the Communist Party, much like Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, and the People's Republic of North Korea still today. So North Korea, being a communist nation today, operates very much like those nations we talked about during the 50s and 60s, China and Soviet Russia. So that's all background. Still, let's talk about your questions. Number one, the French ruled Vietnam before World War II. So French rule before World War II during the colonial period, time of imperialism, European countries colonizing, imperializing Southeast Asia and Africa. So France is in control since the late 1800s. After World War II, they come back. They want their territories back. USA supports France with over $1 billion and military support. Why? Because they're afraid of communism. The policy of containment, again, seen through U.S. financial support. So what does that mean? Well, you start to get resistance groups who rise up against the French. The first being the leadership of this man, Ho Chi Minh, who becomes the leader of a group called the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh, and their goal was to gain independence from the foreign rulers, in this case France. And he at one point had fled to China to escape harsh French rule. He returns and begins to lead the communist rebellion. In 1950, the U.S. sent $15 million in aid, still supporting the French, trying to help them defeat Minh and the Viet Minh. But the French eventually are forced to surrender. And France, Great Britain, Soviet Union, USA, China, Laos, and Cambodia all met with the Viet Minh to set up a peace plan, which is called the Geneva Accords. And they divided, at this conference, they divided Vietnam into two sections, which is what split North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Communist North Vietnam and the Republican South Vietnam, which we'll get to, but anti-communist South Vietnam. So the Geneva Accords splits Vietnam in two. And the United States gets involved. After the French defeat, the United States took a more active role in halting the spread of communism. So the United States is afraid that communism is going to spread from the north, and they're not going to agree with these Geneva Accords and spread to the south. So Ho Chi Minh becomes a national hero despite his very harsh leadership. The people love him. In South Vietnam, you got this president essentially appointed by Truman and the American leadership, and he operates kind of like a puppet, doing what the United States want to. But he was also a very, very brutal man, a harsh dictator, and he refused to take part in countrywide elections. So part of South Vietnam's ideas in the Geneva Accords was that they'd hold open elections, and he refuses because he knew he would lose. But the USA backs him anyhow. They promised Diem aid and training to build a strong government in South Vietnam because he wasn't a communist. So despite the fact that he persecuted a lot of groups, especially Buddhists and other groups in Vietnam, the United States still supported him because he wasn't a communist, and that was their greatest fear. Diem didn't use the funds as he should and angered many, and this group becomes the communist rebel group in South Vietnam, the Viet Cong. They led assassinations against South Vietnamese government officials, and Ho Chi Minh in the north supported these groups in the south, the rebel groups, the communist rebel groups, and he sent supplies through what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So he sends weapons and money from the north to support these communist uprisings in the south, which scares the United States to death because they're worried that the same thing that happened in North Vietnam is going to happen in South Vietnam. Enter Kennedy. Kennedy initially sent Diem more supplies, money, and military advisors, but he realizes Diem's not using those responsibly, and by the end of 1963, we get the first military personnel on the ground in South Vietnam, 16,000 military personnel. So that means advisors and troops. Diem started to move Vietnamese families into safer areas, which they resented. So he starts to move people out of conflict zones, and the people start to detest Diem even more. I mentioned how he persecuted Buddhists. He was actually Catholic, like Kennedy, ironically, because that was a minority group. So he represented the minority Catholics in South Vietnam, and he heavily persecuted the Buddhists. So people began to resent him even more. He burned temples, killed hundreds of Buddhist clerics. Many protested, and eventually he's assassinated by a strange conglomeration of government troops supported by the U.S. and South Vietnam. So there's a coup in South Vietnam. Diem's killed. About the same time, Kennedy, ironically, is assassinated too in November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. In this ceremony, as he's being paraded through the streets of Dallas, he's shot, and the United States is in shock. After Kennedy's death, Johnson, the vice president, becomes the president. Kennedy wanted out of Vietnam, but because of his assassination, Johnson took over, and he actually escalated America's role in Vietnam. So South Vietnam is becoming increasingly more unstable. The United States is still operating on this idea of containment, and Johnson pushes the United States to become even more involved in the war. Which brings us to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. What really happened? Let me give you a little background. Gulf of Tonkin resolution happens August 17, 1964, and this gives Congress broad approval to expand their Vietnamese war effort. But back up 3 months, spring of 1964. The U.S. military planners, they're sitting around with President Johnson, and they are planning for a war in Vietnam, but they're afraid the public won't support a war. By the summer, however, rebel forces, the Viet Cong, they've got a lot of control in Vietnam, and the United States needs to do something about it. So what happens? A U.S. ship is sent to Vietnam, the USS Maddox, and it's fired upon in the Gulf of Tonkin by North Vietnamese Army. They missed, but why did they do that? Because the U.S. ship was within Vietnamese waters that they were not supposed to be in. What does the president and the government say? Well, the U.S. ship was not within restricted waters, and this was an act of aggression by North Vietnamese, by North Vietnam, and we have a reason to go to war. Well, eventually go to war. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution says this: Johnson decided shortly after this to start dropping bombs on North Vietnam, which is Operation Rolling Thunder, which you're going to learn about in more detail in a presentation. And the Tonkin resolution gives him the power to do that. So it gives Johnson broad military powers in Vietnam. And from this point forward, the U.S. takes a much more active role and establishes a presence in Vietnam. So this was the reason the United States said they could go in. But what really happened that day? Very controversial. Yeah, we're going to pause right there. Why is it controversial? I'll post this video and it talks more about it, but essentially many people claim the United States staged this whole thing. They went into enemy waters, tried to get the North Vietnamese troops to fire upon them, and then they could strike back and give the United States and the government a reason to go to war. So many people say the U.S. government staged the whole thing. Nonetheless, from this point forward, U.S. involvement and escalation begins. A lot of key terms here, but the main idea here is the United States sent troops to fight in Vietnam, and the war quickly turns sour. So Johnson increases U.S. involvement. At this time, you got to understand, American public opinion about the war, they greatly supported Johnson and his determination to contain communism in Vietnam. So when he later decides we need to send large numbers of troops to fight alongside the South Vietnamese, the people agree. Most people. So strong support for containment, like I talked about, in 1965. Johnson wants to send the troops, and the people support. I'm not about to send, this is him claiming he's not going to send troops, but by 1965, because most Americans agree, 61% of Americans support the war, and only 24% oppose it, he's able to, by the end of 1965, send the first shipment of troops across the waters to Vietnam. And I'm going to have to start lecture 2.